hostage taking has run amok. Literally, someone, somewhere, every day is subject to that risk all around the world. And it's both private groups and governments that have been doing hostage taking since history, recorded history, and they are really at it. Widespread. There are actually at least 5 categories of hostage taking. 3 of them are essentially local, don't involve international affairs that much. And those are ransom taking, people who take hostages who want money. And there are people who take over schools and churches. And then there are the people who take over prisons to try to improve the conditions at prisons. And those are very important and very difficult issues to have to deal with. But I'm going to focus my remarks today on the fact that there are also terrorists who are hostage takers. And there are governments that are hostage takers, often just to trade a hostage for a criminal. And you've seen that quite recently. The first example of my involvement with hostage taking came within 5 days of my being sworn in as the legal advisor at the Department of State. TWA 847 was seized by a bunch of hostage-taking Palestinian terrorists and flown from Athens ultimately to Beirut. It was very difficult for us to consider using force on the Beirut airport, as you might imagine. There were many Americans on the plane, and any thought that we could use force disappeared when the hostage takers decided that they were going to kill. You can see what this young man, a Navy diver, Stetham, whose body was thrown on the tarmac. We got together and said we're going to take a chance, use force, but they took the hostages, separated them, and spread them around the town of Beirut, so it became really quite impossible for us to use force. The issue then became what to do to negotiate, and President Assad of Syria, of all people, stepped in and said, I will help. But he had nothing to work with. They had made a whole bunch of crazy demands, as often happens with hostage takers. But one of the demands was for the release of 700 plus Shiites that Israel had seized in the Lebanon war. And Israel was ready to release them. In fact, we had made a statement. My office, as legal advisor, had made a statement before the hijacking that these prisoners were being held illegally. So I wrote a memo saying we should tell Assad that he can offer those 700 plus Shiite prisoners, and Israel has agreed to that they would release them if we needed that. But the State Department operates, you write a memo as one department head, and all the other departments weigh in, and they said, no way. We're not going to give in to any terrorist demand, however reasonable. And somehow my memo got to the White House, and the White House reversed the State Department. Assad got the authority, the deal was made, and all those lives were saved. Incidentally, that still allowed us to pursue people who had been involved in the hostage-taking for criminal violations, and we did. We caught a terrorist named Hamadi in Germany, and the Germans sentenced him to life imprisonment. He spent over 18 years in prison. Now, the next issue that I faced was very soon thereafter, same year, the seizure by another Palestinian group, the PLF, of the Achille Lauro. The Achille Lauro was a beautiful Italian passenger ship that was on its way to Eilat in Israel. And the terrorists were not interested in the ship. They weren't interested in the passengers. They wanted to get to Eilat, get off the ship, and kill as many Israelis as possible. That was their aim. However, someone walked into their cabin, saw that they had guns, and so they took over the ship. And one of the first things they did in the work on that was to kill this man, Leon Klinghoffer, who was sitting in a wheelchair because he couldn't walk, and threw his body into the Mediterranean. That led us to decide it was time to act, time to use force to take over this ship and take the chance. But Egypt had worked with Italy and gotten together with the head of the PLF, Muhammad Abbas, who flew in from Tunis, where he was stationed, and got a deal. They turned over the ship, they turned over all the passengers, everybody was saved, but the problem for us was that Egypt gave the terrorists an Egypt Air plane to fly them home to Tunis. It was like a bank robber being offered a getaway car if he would give back the bank the money that he had stolen. Worse, really. So the President Reagan at the time, decided that he would use the U.S. Air Force to intervene with this Egypt airplane in international airspace and get them to land where? Well, it turned out the only place we could get them to land was on a NATO base in Sicily. And as soon as they landed, we had Marines surround the plane, and Italy had their Marines and gendarmes surround our Marines. It meant that we basically had to defer to Italy. This was Italian territory, and the lease made it very clear they were in charge. And so they took over, and they let Abbas, who was really ultimately the main culprit, even though he wasn't on the ship, they let him free. But we argued as effectively as possible that the individuals should not be allowed to escape because they had murdered someone. And the Italians agreed and prosecuted several of those terrorists and sent them to jail for quite a few years. In addition to that, we did negotiate with Egypt a maritime terrorism convention that was somewhat helpful. So overall, our persistence paid off to some degree. It's a very hard time. Now, the next one that we have will really ring a bell with you, and that was the Daniloff case. Nicholas Daniloff was in Moscow as the reporter for a U.S. News and World Report, and he was approached by a CIA agent in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and urged to help the CIA, essentially, talk to someone who wanted to talk to him, someone who had cooperated with the U.S. before. And we had just arrested a guy named Zakharov in New York for espionage and indicted him. So the Soviets let us know that Daniloff had been arrested for espionage and that they would prosecute him unless we released Zakharov for Daniloff. Sounds familiar. Well, Reagan said, no way. Daniloff's just a reporter. This other guy, Zakharov, he's a spy. We're not going to make any trade. Of course, Shultz went along, Secretary Shultz, Secretary of State. The problem was that we were really making progress with the Soviet Union in terms of negotiation. An arms control negotiation was scheduled for Geneva for the first time in a long time. And Shultz was very depressed about this. He was my boss, of course, and at a meeting, he made that very clear. I was paid a visit by former Secretary of State Cyrus Vance. He walked into my office and said, I represent Daniloff and U.S. News and World Report. He had a very sensitive job. He had to convince me that there was enough evidence against Daniloff to make a trade reasonable. So he shows me all the evidence that the Soviets had concocted against Daniloff, and it included a package that replicated the package that the FBI had prepared for Zakharov. They were very careful, and they really were very professional about it. And at the next meeting I had with Secretary Shultz, I told him the contents of that package. I explained to him the evidence the Soviets had developed against Daniloff, and I told him that if Daniloff were tried for espionage in my court — I had just come from a district court in New York where I had been a federal district judge — he would be convicted. And so Shultz stands up, he says, let's call this meeting to an end. Abe, meet me in the garage. I get to the garage of the State Department. He says, we're going to see the president. Tell him what you told me this morning. We zip over, we head into the Oval Office, where I had a hearing in front of the President of the United States to try to convince him that Daniloff would go to prison if he were tried in a U.S. court. And he said, Abe, you know how you speak. Abe, you know he isn't really a spy. Zakharov really a spy. We're not going to trade. You wouldn't be for trading him. And he was trying to talk me out of my position. So I said, Mr. President, I'm not talking morality here. I'm talking about evidence and the elements of crimes. And there's no doubt whatsoever that if he were tried in my courtroom, he would be found guilty of espionage. The president followed us out the room. We had to back out of the Oval Office. He was so eager to try to change my mind. We got in the car to the State Department, and Schultz said, we've lost that one, Abe. I said, no, sir. Let's wait and see what they say. Within an hour, we get a message. SOFARE should send the papers to the Department of Justice, and they will confirm whether his appraisal is correct or not. Of course, I did that immediately. Within 2 hours, one of the highest level people in the Department of Justice confirmed my reading of the papers, and a deal was made, and Daniloff was traded for Zakharov, and Shultz made a secret deal on the side for the release of about 10 Jews who had been refused the right to leave the Soviet Union. This was a very important precedent that led to, ultimately, the release of some 1 million Jews on that ground. That settlement also led to the reinfusion of energy in the negotiation between the Soviets and the United States, which, as you know, led to some pretty extraordinary results. Now, the next matter that I was involved in was the biggest of all, and that was the state of Iran working through Hezbollah in Lebanon to seize hostages. And over the period of 81 to 91, 100 Americans had been seized as hostages. Several of them were still hostages when I started serving. And the frustration of that led the NSC staff and the president to make a deal to sell arms to Iran in exchange for the release of hostages. And that was revealed by the Lebanese press. I didn't even believe it when I heard it. I went to a meeting that day with the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, and Shamir leans over to me and he says, "Too bad about Iran." I didn't believe it until that moment. And then, of course, we did have the investigation, and the deal was ended. And then Bush made his statement. He said, "Please release our hostages. Goodwill will beget goodwill." And Rafsanjani, who is the president of Iran, did release all the hostages. And I want you to see these. This was the firing of all the people in Iran-Contra. And this was Bush making the statement about goodwill begets goodwill. And here he is, Rafsanjani, the guy who got all the hostages released, and Bush said, I'm sorry, you're still doing bad things abroad, and we're not going to do it. And this was too bad because his friendship with the Ayatollah Khamenei was pretty intense. And it was an opportunity missed. Now, what do these four experiences teach us? And that's what I want to just spend 1 minute with you on. They teach us that we have to negotiate. It is wrong to say you don't negotiate with terrorists. We got a lot out of negotiating. The second thing is we have to be true to ourselves. We have to maintain our credibility in our negotiations. And we didn't when we traded arms for hostages. And we didn't when we didn't respond to Rafsanjani. We should have responded. There was an opportunity there that was missed. And the fact is, force is essential, but it's rarely practicable. And so you have to have other options when you deal with this kind of problem. And so I want to end with the fact that laws are important, but practical solutions are far better when you're talking about hostage taking. And this chart will show you how airline hijackings, which we talked about earlier, have changed materially from a time in 1974. You could see they were over 80 in 1969. In 1974, we implemented screening, and that led to a major drop down around 20. And then in 2001, you see where we had the catastrophe of 9/11, we put metal doors that protected the pilot cabins, and you could see that led to hijackings virtually being ended. Now, these lessons will not apply to all situations. They certainly don't apply to states that don't care about law at all, and they're just out there to murder people they hate for some reason or the other. But experience demonstrates that we can improve our response to hostage-taking through negotiations, strength, credibility, and, of course, holding people accountable when they don't do a good job. That would help. The lives saved and the good that a disciplined commitment to these principles actually can bring about is nothing short of inspirational. Thank you.